First there was their gear. They wore long swords at their waists and leather armor. This made them far too well equipped to be the community watch group. Also, the men's builds and faces didn't fit people who worked the fields. They seemed accustomed to violence. The men walked without saying a word. Nothing could be heard besides their footfalls in the quiet village. The night's darkness enveloped everything. It felt eerily like everything had gone extinct, but the men moved on unfazed. Their calm proved they'd done this many times. The village they marched through was completely encompassed by a high wall. From their current vantage point, they could see 6 watchtowers. The towers were sturdily constructed, even better than those in regions where monsters frequently appeared. More than a settlement, this was a strategic point. But still, if a third party saw it, they might assume it was a normal village with stricter security than most. That said, what came next would probably provoke some confusion. The sight was that strange. Normally walls surrounded residences and storehouses. Fields spread out beyond them. Cultivating fields inside the village meant that an extensive wall had to be built around the arable land. This took too much time and labor, but in this village, they de-enclosed the green plants waving in the breeze. It was as if they were protecting gold. The men walking through this weird village felt someone's gaze following them from one of the watchtowers. They had friends armed with bows and arrows there. If something happened, they could wave their lanterns overhead to call for assistance. Considering the archery skills of their comrades, the two felt it would be best to refrain from requesting support fire. But it was incredibly reassuring to know that everyone would get up if the tower bell rang. If the patrolling men waved their lanterns due to misunderstanding, all their sleeping colleagues would be angry. But if there were signs of anything strange, they planned to call for backup right away. The pair didn't want to die, not that they thought anything would happen. They'd been doing the same thing over and over for months. They would probably continue doing it. Even though they'd lost interest in what would come next, they walked through the village along the specified route. Right as they reached the halfway point of their patrol, something slipped over the man's mouth. It felt like a snake. No, snake wasn't quite right. It had attached to his mouth, and wouldn't come off. It was more like an octopus's tentacle. Next, his jaw was yanked up. Searing pain tore across his exposed neck. This all took less than a second. A sound like something drinking reached him from his neck, and that was the last thing this man heard in his life. The hand over the man's mouth let go. It moved to support him from behind so he wouldn't crumple to the ground. After confirming that the magic weapon, vampire blade, had drunk all the blood, another hand extracted it from the man's throat. The figure propping up the man was dressed all in black. Every part except the eyes was covered with pitch-black cloth. The outfit may have been cloth, but the wearer also wore vambraces and greaves to improve defense. A metal plate was worn over the chest. It had a distinctly female contour. Another figure, similarly dressed all in black, and with a similarly contoured breastplate, stood behind the man. The first woman looked her way and moved her head in a single, slight nod. She took note of their stealth kills and scanned the area. It didn't seem like anyone had noticed. She was relieved. The lanterns still gave off light, but the women stuck close to them. The guards in the watchtower probably couldn't tell what had happened. She had been worried about detection in the moment they attacked. They used darkness crossing to teleport short distances between shadows, but that fear was past now. Still holding her dagger, redder after draining her victim's blood, she supported the corpse so he didn't fall. To the guards in the watchtower, it must have looked as if the men patrolling had stopped. If the bodies remained standing still for too long or crumpled to the ground, it would arouse suspicion. That's why they needed to move immediately onto the next step. But that wasn't her job. Suddenly, her hands sensed the vibration of something like a pillar running through the man's body. The corpse jerked into motion a second later, proving it was not her imagination. She wasn't surprised the man was moving despite being dead. It was all according to plan. She let go and used a skill at the same time. It was one of her ninja skills, Shadow Dive. The ability allowed her to completely melt into the surroundings, anywhere there was shadow. This rendered her impossible to discover with normal eyesight. Leaving behind the two who had vanished into the darkness, the pair of corpses advanced as if their chains had come off. They followed the original route they were supposed to follow. It was as if they just remembered what their jobs were. The only difference was their movements had become slow and heavy. The reason no blood spurted from their necks, even though their wounds hadn't healed, was simply that there wasn't any left. There was only one reason they would be moving in such a state. They'd been made into zombies and were moving according to their master's orders. It wasn't the two women who had turned them. A casual glance would reveal only the two men they expected, and even if an observer could glimpse the women's murky forms, there would still be only 4 people. But there was a 5th person. This person had created the zombies. The women couldn't see this 5th person either. However, a ninjutsu technique they had mastered allowed them to perceive beings hidden by magic or skills, so they could detect a presence directly in front of them. Preparation here is complete. Perfect, they responded in low voices. A similarly quiet voice replied, "Yeah, I know, I was watching. I am moving to the next location. We have to catch the high-ranking guys if we can." This was also a woman's voice, but it was higher pitched. It had an air of immaturity, like a child's voice. "I am also going on to the next raid. Where are the other 2? Probably off screwing around since they don't have anything to do. I don't think so. They were hiding out near the village. They were ready to simultaneously attack the front and rear in case of an emergency. All right, I am going to go to the highest priority location. You guys should also proceed according to plan." Their invisible comrade, whom they could sense only by her presence, floated lightly up into the sky. She was using fly to travel through the air. The receding presence moved toward the building she had called the highest priority location. It was one of the buildings in this village. It was a critical foothold they needed to capture first. Normally, they would want to prioritize other buildings, but that one was designated as the most urgent because of the magic spell message. Many people avoided conveying information via message. It was often unreliable and difficult to confirm the authenticity of dispatches. At the same time, some used the spell without worrying about the shortcomings. This was true of the Empire. Magical education was promoted on a national level there. There were also several major merchant networks. They prioritized gathering information as fast as possible. The enemies who controlled this village were much the same. So first, it was necessary to capture the communications person in that building. Now that their comrade had departed, the pair needed to quickly hide out near their objective. It was important to execute everything at the same time. They needed to complete the raid before anyone realized it was happening. With sharp exhalations, the 2 ninjas set off running. No normal person would notice them, moving as they did from shadow to shadow. Even high-level adventurers would have had a hard time discovering these intruders. The ninjas were equipped with magic items. In other words, no one in this village could see them. Her companion running parallel to her dexterously moved her fingers. All she did was bend her digits in various ways, but the meaning was clear. "Good thing they didn't have a dog," she answered with her fingers. Agreed. It was the sign language of assassins. When one was as proficient as they were, it was possible to convey information just as fast as talking. They taught it to their comrades, but unfortunately, they could use it for only simple signs and instructions. These 2, however, had speed and vocabulary suitable for daily conversation, so they used it for clandestine small talk like this often. No doubt about it. It is so much easier when they don't gather around the scent of blood. If the men had a dog, things wouldn't have gone so smoothly. They prepared a way to render an animal powerless, but there was nothing better than not having to deal with more problems. After her reply, her comrade's fingers moved speedily. "Then I'll head to my target building according to plan." When she replied with a "got it," the comrade running next to her gradually veered away. Left alone, she glanced sidelong at the fields while she sprinted. What was being cultivated there wasn't wheat or some other grain. It wasn't vegetables either. The plant was used as raw material in the manufacture of the most rampant illegal drug in the kingdom, black flour. There were several fields inside this walled village, but they were all growing the same thing. That proved this village was a narcotics production base. Black flour, also sometimes called lila powder, was a black powdered drug taken by drinking it in solution. It was mass-produced and cheap. It was also a simple, effective route to intoxicated euphoria, so it was the most well-known narcotic in the kingdom. Moreover, while the drug was addictive, there were supposedly no side effects, so it was in widespread use. Thinking about the information they had about the drug, she snorted. There was no such thing as a drug with no side effects. The "I can quit whenever I want" misunderstanding was ridiculous. She performed autopsies on dead black flower addicts. All their brains had shrunk to about 4/5 their original size. Black flower, produced from wild plants, was a powerful poison. Why did anyone believe a plant that toxic wasn't also addictive? Street-ready black flower could be categorized as a narcotic. However, this was only because it wasn't very potent. Even so, it was extremely addictive. It also remained in the body for a long time. Most users took another dose before the first one had completely left their system. Unless they went to a priest to have the substance forcibly removed via magic, it was virtually impossible for people who reached a certain degree of addiction to completely quit of their own free will. The most problematic thing about this horrible drug was that the symptoms of withdrawal were not pronounced. Even if people had a bad trip, they didn't go on a rampage or hurt anyone around them. Consequently, the kingdom authorities failed to understand the threat. They spent all their efforts exposing the evils of other drugs. This practically gave people tacit permission to use black flower. She knew the empire even claimed that the kingdom was secretly supporting the industry. When she had been an assassin, she had occasionally used drugs. Her organization had grown them, so she wasn't against them. Narcotics could in fact have wonderful effects when used properly. They were basically medicinal herbs with a dangerous element. But this time she was out on a job, so her personal opinion didn't enter into it. However, requests that don't come through the Adventurers Guild are dangerous. She wasn't really convinced the job was the best idea either. She frowned under her face covering. The client was a friend of her team's leader. They were being paid a fair amount, but there were all sorts of issues that could crop up from taking a job without going through the guild. This was true even if they were one of only 2 adamantite adventurer teams in the kingdom. Wait, there are 3 now, she thought. As she remembered hearing news of a new adamantite team, she arrived at the building they had codenamed Number 2. Her role was to gather all the intelligence she could find inside. When that was done, she had to set fire to the fields. The smoke from the burning narcotic plants would be poisonous. If she didn't do it, she couldn't complete her mission. Depending on the direction of the wind, some villagers might be harmed, but there was no time or means to have them evacuate. They were necessary sacrifices. She told herself this and hurled her concern for the villagers' safety into oblivion. Raised as an assassin, she was rarely moved by a loss of life, particularly if it was someone she didn't even know. Then no matter what happened to them, she wouldn't so much as twitch an eyebrow. The only thing she considered was how she hated the look on her leader's face whenever there were innocent victims. For this operation, they had their leader's approval, so she didn't feel even the slightest inclination to try saving anyone. More importantly, after this raid was over, she would teleport straight to another village. She would burn down the fields in exactly the same way. The plan fully occupied her head. This wasn't the only village where they produced the base for the drug. According to their research, there were 10 places in the kingdom where large-scale growing operations were located. And there were probably still others they hadn't discovered. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for these groups to yield the estimated amount necessary for the drug to spread all over the kingdom like it had. We have to pick the weeds where they grow. It might be in vain, but it's all we can do. If there were written orders from the organization in this village, that would be excellent. But she didn't expect things to go so smoothly. The most they could hope for was that the village's overseer would have some information. Their leader would be happy if she could unearth at least part of the organization. The huge crime syndicate manufacturing the narcotic was called the 8 Fingers. Their name came from a deity subordinate to the god of earth, the god of theft, who had 8 fingers. It was a massive organization that dominated the kingdom's underworld. The outfit was split into 8 divisions: slave trafficking, assassination, smuggling, thievery, drug dealing, security, moneylending, and gambling. They were said to be behind every underworld crew in the kingdom. Because the group was so large, the full truth about it was shrouded in mystery. However, one thing proved how far the 8 Fingers had reached into the kingdom: the village before her eyes. They were growing illegal drugs right out in the open. This fact proved that the noble holding power in this land was an accomplice, but even if she exposed the crime, she would be unable to accuse the lord or lady. If the royal family made an inquiry or the judicial officials became involved, that would be a different story. But they would still encounter difficulties in pinning the crime on a landed aristocrat. This fiefdom's ruler would probably claim they had no knowledge this was being used to make a narcotic, or they might say the villagers did it on their own to shift blame. Charging nobility directly wasn't very effective. Even if efforts were made to suppress circulation, the Eight Fingers had seduced several nobles who were now involved in the distribution routes. The situation had become impossible to resolve using guards and other regular means. That's why they were currently relying on the violent last resort of burning the fields. It was the only option left. Honestly, she didn't think burning the fields would work to address even the symptom. The syndicate had undermined the kingdom to that extent. It was too powerful and had reached its tentacles into the government. We were merely buying time. If we can strike a target where we can turn the tables with one blow, then this too will all be in vain. It was raining. The sound was so intense it grated on the ears. The kingdom's roads weren't built with drainage in mind, especially in the back streets. As a result, the alleys transformed into huge lakes. The rain beating down on the water sent up little splashes. The wind whipped up the spray and filled the air with its scent. It felt as if the royal capital itself had sunk into a body of water. In this world colored gray by whirling droplets, there was a boy. He lived in a shack, though it could hardly be called that. The main beams holding it up were about as thin as an adult man's arms. Instead of a solid roof, rags draped over the shelter to cover it. The walls were no more than ceiling cloths sloppily hanging down. In this dwelling, which offered hardly any shelter from the elements outside, the boy, about 6 years of age, lay on a thin cloth spread out on the floor. He was curled up like a casually tossed piece of garbage. If one stopped to think about it, the wooden beams, the scraps that formed the ceiling and walls, it seemed like the kind of thing a child could build, even just for fun. The only real benefit of this home was it kept the rain from falling directly on him. The endless rain had drastically lowered the temperature and enveloped the boy in a shivery chill. His foggy exhalations provided brief evidence of his existence, then they faded away as the air stole their warmth. Before sheltering here, the cold rain had drenched him. His body heat was deserting him at a terrible pace. He had no way to stop the shivering. The single silver lining of this miserable situation was that the permeating chill felt good to his bruised and beaten body. Still lying on his side, the boy looked out at the world. He looked at the alley no one walked down anymore. The only sounds he could hear were the rainfall and his own breathing. The scene gave him the impression there was no one else in the world. That was the extent of the calm. Although he was young, he understood he would likely die. Not old enough to fully understand what death entailed, the boy wasn't very afraid. That and life didn't seem worth holding dear. He managed to hang on so far because he wanted to avoid pain. If death would come without pain, only cold, like he felt at that very moment, then dying didn't seem so bad. He gradually lost feeling in his wet body. His consciousness clouded. It would have been better to move somewhere the wind and rain wouldn't come in before the weather turned. But he run into some nasty men and received a beating. Getting back here had been all he could manage. There was one tiny happy thing. Did that mean everything else was sad? He hadn't eaten in 2 days, which was normal, so that wasn't sad. His parents were absent and no one else would care for him. This had been the case for a long time. It wasn't something to be upset about. He was dressed in rags and smelled bad. That was only natural. Eating rotten food and drinking dirty water to fill his belly was all he'd ever known. Was it sad that the abandoned house where he had been living had been stolen from him? Was it sad that the hut he'd worked hard to build had been trashed for someone else's amusement? And were the beatings from drunk men, leaving injuries all over his body, sad? No. The heartbreaking truth was that the boy couldn't even understand what was sad or why. But this was the end. The sorrow he didn't even understand would end here. The grave called for the lucky and the unlucky alike. Yes, death was absolute. He closed his eyes. Keeping them open was too much effort for a body that had ceased to feel even the cold. He could hear his tiny, frail heartbeat in the darkness. In a world where only that and the rain could be heard, another strange sound appeared. It was like something blocking the rain. Despite his fading consciousness, he mustered the curiosity peculiar to children and urged his eyelids to move. In the thin strip of his field of vision, he saw it. The boy's nearly closed eyes popped wide open. Something beautiful. For a moment he couldn't understand. Perhaps like a jewel or like a nugget of gold were the right descriptors, but to someone who'd been abandoned, who'd lived eating half-rotten food, those words didn't come to mind. No, he thought one thing. Like the sun, that was the most beautiful thing he knew, the most out of reach. The world dyed grey by the rain.